Indeed, upon Mr. Dorrit likewise, in fact, upon the family. Turning graciously to the attendants, Miss Fanny inquired whether her papa or brother was within. The reply being that they were both within, Mr. Sparkler humbly offered his arm. Miss Fanny, accepting it, was squired up the great staircase by Mr. Sparkler, who, if he still believed, which there is not any reason to doubt, that she had no nonsense about her, rather deceived himself. Arrived in a mouldering reception-room, where the faded hangings of a sad sea-green had worn and withered until they looked as if they might have claimed kindred with the waifs of seaweed drifting under the windows or clinging to the walls and weeping for their imprisoned relations, Miss Fanny dispatched emissaries for her father and brother. Pending whose appearance, she showed to great advantage on a sofa, completing Mr. Sparkler's conquest with some remarks upon Dante, known to that gentleman as an eccentric man in the nature of an old file, who used to put leaves round his head and sit upon a stool for some unaccountable purpose, outside the cathedral at Florence. Mr. Dorrit welcomed the visitor with the highest urbanity and most courtly manners. He inquired particularly after Mrs. Merdle. He inquired particularly after Mr. Merdle. Mr. Sparkler said, or rather twitched out of himself in small pieces by the shirt-collar, that Mrs. Merdle, having completely used up her place in the country, and also her house in Brighton, and being, of course, unable, don't you see, to remain in London, when there wasn't a soul there, and not feeling herself this year quite up to visiting about at people's places, had resolved to have a touch at Rome, where a woman like herself, with a proverbially fine appearance, and with no nonsense about her, couldn't fail to be a great acquisition. As to Mr. Merdle, he was so much wanted by the men in the city and the rest of those places, and was such a deuced extraordinary phenomenon in buying and banking, and that Mr. Sparkler doubted if the monetary system of the country would be able to spare him, though that his work was occasionally one too many for him, and that he would be all the better for a temporary shy at an entirely new scene and climate, Mr. Sparkler did not conceal. As to himself, Mr. Sparkler conveyed to the Dorrit family that he was going on rather particular business wherever they were going. This immense conversational achievement required time, but was effective. Being effected, Mr. Dorrit expressed his hope that Mr. Sparkler would shortly dine with them. Mr. Sparkler received the idea so kindly that Mr. Dorrit asked what he was going to do that day, for instance. As he was going to do nothing that day, his usual occupation, and one for which he was particularly qualified, he was secured without postponement, being further bound over to accompany the ladies to the opera in the evening. At dinner-time, Mr. Sparkler rose out of the sea, like Venus's son taking after his mother, and made a splendid appearance ascending the great staircase. If Fanny had been charming in the morning, she was now thrice charming, very becomingly dressed in her most suitable colours, and with an air of negligence upon her that doubled Mr. Sparkler's fetters and riveted them. "I hear you are acquainted, Mr. Sparkler," said his host at dinner, "with Mr. Gowan, Mr. Henry Gowan?" "Perfectly, sir," returned Mr. Sparkler. "His mother and my mother are cronies, in fact." "If I had any thought of it, Amy," said Mr. Dorrit, with a patronage as magnificent as that of Lord Decimus himself, "you should have dispatched a note to them, asking them to dine to-day. Some of our people could have fetched them and taken them home. We could have spared a gondola for that purpose. I am sorry to have forgotten this. Pray remind me of them tomorrow." Little Dorrit was not without doubts how Mr. Henry Gowan might take their patronage, but she promised not to fail in the reminder. "Pray, does Mr. Henry Gowan paint portraits?" inquired Mr. Dorrit. Mr. Sparkler opined that he painted anything if he could get the job. "He has no particular walk," said Mr. Dorrit. Mr. Sparkler, stimulated by love to brilliancy, replied that for a particular walk a man ought to have a particular pair of shoes, as, for example, shooting shoes, cricket shoes, whereas he believed that Henry Gowan had no particular pair of shoes. "No speciality," said Mr. Dorrit. This being a very long word for Mr. Sparkler, and his mind being exhausted by his late effort, he replied, "No, thank you, I seldom take it." "Well," said Mr. Dorrit, "it would be very agreeable to me to present a gentleman so connected with some testimonial of my desire to further his interest and develop the germs of his genius. I think I must engage Mr. Gowan to paint my picture. If the result should be mutually satisfactory, I might afterwards engage him to try his hand upon my family." The exquisitely bold and original thought presented itself to Mr. Sparkler that there was an opening here for saying there were some of the family, emphasizing some in a marked manner, to whom no painter could render justice. But for want of a form of words in which to express the idea, it returned to the skies. This was the more to be regretted, as Miss Fanny greatly applauded the notion of the portrait, and urged her papa to act upon it. She surmised, she said, that Mr. Gowan had lost better and higher opportunities by marrying his pretty wife, and love in a cottage, painting pictures for dinner, was so delightfully interesting that she begged her papa to give him the commission, whether he could paint a likeness or not, though indeed both she and Amy knew he could, from having seen a speaking likeness of his easel that day, and having had the opportunity of comparing it with the original. These remarks made Mr. Sparkler, as perhaps they were intended to do, nearly distracted, for while on the one hand they expressed Miss Fanny's susceptibility of the tender passion, she herself showed such an innocent unconsciousness of his admiration that his eyes goggled in his head with jealousy of an unknown rival. Descending into the sea again after dinner, and ascending out of it at the opera staircase, preceded by one of their gondoliers, like an attendant merman, with a great linen lantern, they entered their box, and Mr. Sparkler entered on an evening of agony. The theatre being dark and the box light, several visitors lounged in during the representation, in whom Fanny was so interested, and in conversation with whom she fell into such charming attitudes as she had little confidences with them, and little disputes concerning the identity of people in distant boxes, that the wretched Sparkler hated all mankind. But he had two consolations at the close of the performance. She gave him her fan to hold while she adjusted her cloak, and it was his blessed privilege to give her his arm downstairs again. These crumbs of encouragement Mr. Sparkler thought would just keep him going, and it is not impossible that Miss Dorrit thought so too. The merman with his light was ready at the box door, and other mermen with other lights were ready at many of the doors. The Dorrit merman held his lantern low to show the steps, and Mr. Sparkler put on another heavy set of fetters over his former set, as he watched her radiant feet twinkling down the stairs beside him. Among the loiterers here was Blondois of Paris. He spoke and moved forward beside Fanny. Little Dorrit was in front with her brother and Mrs. General. Mr. Dorrit had remained at home, but on the brink of the quay they all came together. She started again to find Blondois close to her, handing Fanny into the boat. "Gowan has had a loss," he said, "since he was made happy today by a visit from fair ladies." "A loss?" repeated Fanny, relinquished by the bereaved Sparkler and taking her seat. "A loss," said Blondois. "His dog, Lion." Little Dorrit's hand was in his as he spoke. "He is dead," said Blondois. "Dead?" echoed Little Dorrit. "That noble dog?" "Faith, dear ladies," said Blondois, smiling and shrugging his shoulders, "somebody has poisoned that noble dog. He is as dead as the Doges." Chapter 7. Mostly Prunes and Prism. Mrs. General, always on her coach-box, keeping the proprieties well together, took pains to form a surface on her very dear young friend, and Mrs. General's very dear young friend tried hard to receive it. Hard as she had tried in her laborious life to attain many ends, she had never tried harder than she did now, to be varnished by Mrs. General. It made her anxious and ill at ease to be operated upon by that smoothing hand, it is true, but she submitted herself to the family want in its greatness, as she had submitted herself to the family want in its littleness, and yielded to her own inclinations in this thing no more than she had yielded to her hunger itself, in the days when she had saved her dinner that her father might have his supper. One comfort that she had under the ordeal by General was more sustaining to her, and made her more grateful than to a less devoted and affectionate spirit, not habituated to her struggles and sacrifices, might appear quite reasonable, and indeed it may often be observed in life that spirits like Little Dorrit do not appear to reason half as carefully as the folks who get the better of them. The continued kindness of her sister was this comfort to Little Dorrit. It was nothing to her that the kindness took the form of tolerant patronage. She was used to that. It was nothing to her that it kept her in a tributary position, and showed her in attendance on the flaming car in which Miss Fanny sat on an elevated seat, exacting homage. She sought no better place. Always admiring Fanny's beauty and grace and readiness, and not now asking herself how much of her disposition to be strongly attached to Fanny was due to her own heart, and how much to Fanny's, she gave her all the sisterly fondness her great heart contained. The wholesale amount of prunes and prism which Mrs. General infused into the family life, combined with the perpetual plunges made by Fanny into society, left but a very small residue of any natural deposit at the bottom of the mixture. This rendered confidences with Fanny doubly precious to Little Dorrit, and heightened the relief they afforded her. "Amy," said Fanny to her one night, when they were alone, after a day so tiring that Little Dorrit was quite worn out, though Fanny would have taken another dip into society with the greatest pleasure in life, "I am going to put something into your little head. You won't guess what it is, I suspect." "I don't think that's very likely, dear," said Little Dorrit. "Come, I'll give you a clue, child," said Fanny. "Mrs. General." Prunes and prism, in 1,000 combinations, having been wearily in the ascendant all day, everything having been surface and varnish and show without substance, Little Dorrit looked as if she had hoped that Mrs. General was safely tucked up in bed for some hours. "Now, can you guess, Amy?" said Fanny. "No, dear, unless I have done anything," said Little Dorrit, rather alarmed, and meaning anything calculated to crack varnish and ruffle surface. Fanny was so very much amused by the misgiving that she took up her favourite fan, being then seated at a dressing-table with her armoury of cruel instruments about her, most of them reeking from the heart of Sparkler, and tapped her sister frequently on the nose with it, laughing all the time. "Oh, Amy, said Fanny. "What a timid little goose our Amy is! But this is nothing to laugh at. On the contrary, I am very cross, my dear." "As it is not with me, Fanny, I don't mind," returned her sister, smiling. "Ah, but I do mind," said Fanny, "and so will you, pet, when I enlighten you. Amy, has it never struck you that somebody is monstrously polite to Mrs. General?" "Everybody is polite to Mrs. General," said Little Dorrit, because she freezes them into it," interrupted Fanny. "I don't mean that. Quite different from that. Come, has it never struck you, Amy, that Pa is monstrously polite to Mrs. General?" Amy, murmuring, "No," looked quite confounded. "No, I dare say not." "But he is," said Fanny. "He is, Amy, and remember my words. Mrs. General has designs on Pa." "Dear Fanny, do you think it possible that Mrs. General has designs on anyone?" "Do I think it possible?" retorted Fanny. "My love, I know it. I tell you she has designs on Pa. And more than that, I tell you, Pa considers her such a wonder, such a paragon of accomplishment, and such an acquisition to our family, that he is ready to get himself into a state of perfect infatuation with her at any moment. And that opens a pretty picture of things, I hope. Think of me with Mrs. General for a mamma." Little Dorrit did not reply. Think of me with Mrs. General for a mamma? But she looked anxious, and seriously inquired what had led Fanny to these conclusions. Lord, my darling, said Fanny tartly, you might as well ask me how I know when a man is struck with myself. But, of course, I do know. It happens pretty often, but I always know it. I know this in much the same way, I suppose. At all events, I know it. You never heard Papa say anything? Say anything? Repeated Fanny. My dearest darling child, what necessity has he had yet a while to say anything? And you have never heard Mrs. General say anything? My goodness me, Amy, returned Fanny. Is she the sort of woman to say anything? Isn't it perfectly plain and clear that she has nothing to do at present but to hold herself upright, keep her aggravating gloves on, and go sweeping about? Say anything? If she had the ace of trumps in her hand at whist, she wouldn't say anything, child. It would come out when she played it. At least you may be mistaken, Fanny. Now may you not? Oh, yes, I may be, said Fanny, but I am not. However, I am glad you can contemplate such an escape, my dear, and I am glad that you can take this for the present with sufficient coolness to think of such a chance. It makes me hope that you may be able to bear the connection. I should not be able to bear it, and I should not try. I'd marry Sparkler first. Oh, you would never marry him, Fanny, under any circumstances. Upon my word, my dear, rejoined that young lady with exceeding indifference, I wouldn't positively answer even for that. There's no knowing what might happen, especially as I should have many opportunities afterwards of treating that woman, his mother, in her own style, which I most decidedly should not be slow to avail myself of, Amy. No more passed between the sisters then, but what had passed gave the two subjects of Mrs. General and Mr. Sparkler great prominence in little Dorrit's mind, and thenceforth she thought very much of both. Mrs. General, having long ago formed her own surface to such perfection that it hid whatever was below it, if anything, no observation was to be made in that quarter. Mr. Dorrit was undeniably very polite to her, and had a high opinion of her, but Fanny, impetuous at most times, might easily be wrong for all that. Whereas the Sparkler question was on the different footing that anyone could see what was going on there, and little Dorrit saw it and pondered on it with many doubts and wonderings. The devotion of Mr. Sparkler was only to be equalled by the caprice and cruelty of his enslaver. Sometimes she would prefer him to such distinction of notice that he would chuckle aloud with joy. Next day or next hour she would overlook him so completely, and drop him into such an abyss of obscurity that he would groan under a weak pretence of coughing. The constancy of his attendance never touched Fanny, though he was so inseparable from Edward that, when that gentleman wished for a change of society, he was under the irksome necessity of gliding out like a conspirator in disguised boats and by secret doors and backways, though he was so solicitous to know how Mr. Dorrit was, that he called every other day to inquire, as if Mr. Dorrit were the prey of an intermittent fever, though he was so constantly being paddled up and down before the principal windows, that he might have been supposed to have made a wager for a large stake to be paddled 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours, though whenever the gondola of his mistress left the gate, the gondola of Mr. Sparkler shot out from some watery ambush and gave chase, as if she were a fair smuggler and he a custom-house officer. It was probably owing to this fortification of the natural strength of his constitution, with so much exposure to the air and the salt sea, that Mr. Sparkler did not pine outwardly, but, whatever the cause, he was so far from having any prospect of moving his mistress by a languishing state of health, that he grew bluffer every day, and that peculiarity in his appearance of seeming rather a swelled boy than a young man became developed to an extraordinary degree of ruddy puffiness. Blondois, calling to pay his respects, Mr. Dorrit received him with affability as the friend of Mr. Gowan, and mentioned to him his idea of commissioning Mr. Gowan to transmit him to posterity. Blondois highly extolling it, it occurred to Mr. Dorrit that it might be agreeable to Blondois to communicate to his friend the great opportunity reserved for him. Blondois accepted the commission with his own free elegance of manner, and swore he would discharge it before he was an hour older. On his imparting the news to Gowan, that master gave Mr. Dorrit to the devil with great liberality some round dozen of times for he resented patronage almost as much as he resented the want of it, and was inclined to quarrel with his friend for bringing him the message. "It may be a defect in my mental vision, Blondois," said he, "but may I die if I see what you have to do with this?" "Death of my life," replied Blondois, "nor I neither, except that I thought that I was serving my friend." "By putting an upstart's hire in his pocket," said Gowan, frowning. "Do you mean that? Tell your other friend to get his head painted for the sign of some public house, and to get it done by a sign painter. Who am I, and who is he?" "Professore," returned the ambassador, "and who is Blondois?" Without appearing at all interested in the latter question, Gowan angrily whistled Mr. Dorrit away. But next day he resumed the subject by saying in his offhand manner, and with a slighting laugh, "Well, Blondois, when shall we go to this Maecenas of yours? We journeymen must take jobs when we can get them. When shall we go and look after this job?" "When you will," said the injured Blondois, "as you please. What have I to do with it? What is it to me?" "I can tell you what it is to me," said Gowan. "Bread and cheese. One must eat. So come along, my Blondois." Mr. Dorrit received them in the presence of his daughters and of Mr. Sparkler, who happened by some surprising accident to be calling there. "How are you, Sparkler?" said Gowan carelessly. "When you have to live by your mother wit, old boy, I hope you may get on better than I do." Mr. Dorrit then mentioned his proposal. "Sir," said Gowan, laughing, after receiving it gracefully enough, "I am new to the trade and not expert at its mysteries. I believe I ought to look at you in various lights, tell you are a capital subject, and consider when I shall be sufficiently disengaged to devote myself with the necessary enthusiasm to the fine picture I mean to make of you. I assure you," and he laughed again, "I feel quite a traitor in the camp of those dear, gifted, good, noble fellows, my brother artists, by not doing the hocus-pocus better. But I have not been brought up to it, and it's too late to learn it. Now, the fact is, I am a very bad painter, but not much worse than the generality. If you are going to throw away 100 guineas or so, I am as poor as a poor relation of great people usually is, and I shall be very much obliged to you if you'll throw them away upon me. I'll do the best I can for the money, and if the best picture should be bad, why, even then you may probably have a bad picture with a small name to it, instead of a bad picture with a large name to it." This tone, though not what he had expected on the whole, suited Mr. Dorrit remarkably well. It showed that the gentleman, highly connected, and not a mere workman, would be under no obligation to him. He expressed his satisfaction in placing himself in Mr. Gowan's hands, and trusted that he would have the pleasure, in their characters of private gentlemen, of improving his acquaintance. "You are very good," said Gowan. "I have not forsworn society since I joined the Brotherhood of the Brush, the most delightful fellows on the face of the earth, and am glad enough to smell the old fine gunpowder now and then, though it did blow me into mid-air and my present calling. You'll not think, Mr. Dorrit," and here he laughed again in the easiest way, "that I am lapsing into the freemasonry of the craft, for it's not so. Upon my life I can't help betraying it whenever I go. Though, by Jupiter, I love and honour the craft with all my might. If I propose a stipulation as to time and place—" "Ah!" Mr. Dorrit could erect no suspicion of that kind on Mr. Gowan's frankness. "Again, you are very good," said Gowan. "Mr. Dorrit, I hear you are going to Rome. I am going to Rome, having friends there. Let me begin to do you the injustice I have conspired to do you there, not here. We shall all be hurried during the rest of our stay here, and though there's not a poorer man with whole elbows in Venice than myself, I have not quite got all the amateur out of me yet, comprising the trade again, you see, and can't fall on to order in a hurry, for the mere sake of the sixpences." These remarks were not less favourably received by Mr. Dorrit than their predecessors. They were the prelude to the first reception of Mr. and Mrs. Gowan at dinner, and they skilfully placed Gowan on his usual ground in the new family. His wife, too, they placed on her usual ground. Miss Fanny understood with particular distinctness that Mrs. Gowan's good looks had cost her husband very dear, that there had been a great disturbance about her in the Barnacle family, and that the Dowager Mrs. Gowan, nearly heartbroken, had resolutely set her face against the marriage until overpowered by her maternal feelings. Mrs. General likewise clearly understood that the attachment had occasioned much family grief and dissension. Of honest Mr. Meagles no mention was made, except that it was natural enough that a person of that sort should wish to raise his daughter out of his own obscurity, and that no one could blame him for trying his best to do so. Little Dorrit's interest in the fair subject of this easily accepted belief was too earnest and watchful to fail in accurate observation. She could see that it had its part in throwing upon Mrs. Gowan the touch of a shadow under which she lived, and she even had an instinctive knowledge that there was not the least truth in it. But it had an influence in placing obstacles in the way of her association with Mrs. Gowan, by making the Prunes and Prism school excessively polite to her, but not very intimate with her, and little Dorrit, as an enforced sizar of that college, was obliged to submit herself humbly to its ordinances. Nevertheless, there was a sympathetic understanding already established between the two, which would have carried them over greater difficulties, and made a friendship out of a more restricted intercourse. As though accidents were determined to be favourable to it, they had a new assurance of congeniality in the aversion which each perceived that the other felt towards Blondois of Paris, an aversion amounting to the repugnance and horror of a natural antipathy towards an odious creature of the reptile kind. And there was a passive congeniality between them, besides this active one. To both of them Blondois behaved in exactly the same manner, and to both of them his manner had uniformly something in it which they both knew to be different from his bearing towards others. The difference was too minute in its expression to be perceived by others, but they knew it to be there. A mere trick of his evil eyes, a mere turn of his smooth white hand, a mere hair's breadth of addition to the fall of his nose and the rise of his moustache in the most frequent movement of his face, conveyed to both of them equally a swagger personal to themselves. It was as if he had said, "I have a secret power in this quarter. I know what I know." This had never been felt by them both in so great a degree, and never by each so perfectly to the knowledge of each other, as on a day when he came to Mr. Dorrit's to take his leave before quitting Venice. Mrs. Gowan was herself there for the same purpose, and he came upon the two together, the rest of the family being out. The two had not been together 5 minutes, and the peculiar manner seemed to convey to them, "You were going to talk about me, huh? Behold me here to prevent it." "Gowan is coming here," said Blondois with a smile. Mrs. Gowan replied he was not coming. "Not coming?" said Blondois. "Permit your devoted servant, when you leave here, to escort you home." "Thank you, I am not going home." "Not going home?" said Blondois. "Then I am forlorn." That he might be, but he was not so forlorn as to roam away and leave them together. He sat entertaining them with his finest compliments and his choicest conversation, but he conveyed to them all the time, "No, no, no, dear ladies, behold me here expressly to prevent it." He conveyed it to them with so much meaning, and he had such a diabolical persistency in him, that at length Mrs. Gowan rose to depart. On his offering his hand to Mrs. Gowan to lead her down the staircase, she retained little Dorrit's hand in hers with a cautious pressure, and said, "No, thank you, but if you will please to see if my boatman is there, I shall be obliged to you." It left him no choice but to go down before them. As he did so, hat in hand, Mrs. Gowan whispered, "He killed the dog." "Does Mr. Gowan know it?" little Dorrit whispered. "No one knows it. Don't look towards me, look towards him. He will turn his face in a moment. No one knows it, but I am sure he did it. You are?" I think so," little Dorrit answered. "Henry likes him, and he will not think ill of him. He is so generous and open himself. But you and I feel sure that we think of him as he deserves. He argued with Henry that the dog had been already poisoned when he changed so, and sprang at him. Henry believes it, but we do not. I see he is listening, but can't hear. Goodbye, my love, goodbye." The last words were spoken aloud as the vigilant Blondois stopped, turned his head, and looked at them from the bottom of the staircase. Assuredly he did look then, though he looked his politest, as if any real philanthropist could have desired no better employment than to lash a great stone to his neck and drop him into the water, flowing beyond the dark arched gateway in which he stood. No such benefactor to mankind being on the spot, he handed Mrs. Gowan to her boat, and stood there until he had shot out of the narrow view, when he landed himself into his own boat, and followed. Little Dorrit had sometimes thought, and now thought again, as she retraced her steps up the staircase, that he had made his way too easily into her father's house. But so many and such varieties of people did the same, through Mr. Dorrit's participation in his elder daughter's society mania, that it was hardly an exceptional case. A perfect fury for making acquaintance, on whom to impress their riches and importance, had seized the house of Dorrit. It appeared, on the whole, to little Dorrit herself, that this same society in which they lived greatly resembled a superior sort of Marshalsea. Numbers of people seemed to come abroad pretty much as people had come into the prison, through debt, through idleness, relationship, curiosity, and general unfitness for getting on at home. They were brought into these foreign towns in the custody of couriers and local followers, just as the debtors had been brought into the prison. They prowled about the churches and picture galleries, much in the old dreary prison-yard manner. They were usually going away again tomorrow or next week, and rarely knew their own minds, and seldom did what they said they would do, or went where they said they would go, in all this again very like the prison debtors. They paid high for poor accommodation, and disparaged a place while they pretended to like it, which was exactly the Marshalsea custom. They were envied when they went away by people left behind, feigning not to want to go, and that again was the Marshalsea habit invariably. A certain set of words and phrases, as much belonging to tourists as the college and the snuggery belonged to the jail, was always in their mouths. They had precisely the same incapacity for settling down to anything as the prisoners used to have. They rather deteriorated one another, as the prisoners used to do, and they wore untidy dresses and fell into a slouching way of life, still always like the people in the Marshalsea. The period of the family's stay at Venice came in its course to an end, and they moved with their retinue to Rome. Through a repetition of the former Italian scenes, growing more dirty and more haggard as they went on, and bringing them at length to where the very air was diseased, they passed to their destination. A fine residence had been taken for them on the Corso, and there they took up their abode in a city where everything seemed to be trying to stand still for ever on the ruins of something else, except the water which, following eternal laws, tumbled and rolled from its glorious multitude of fountains. Here it seemed to little Dorrit that a change came over the Marshalsea spirit of their society, and that the prunes and prism got the upper hand. Everybody was walking about St. Peter's and the Vatican on somebody else's cork legs, and straining every visible object through somebody else's sieve. Nobody said what anything was, but everybody said what the Mrs. Generals, Mr. Eustace, or somebody else said it was. The whole body of travellers seemed to be a collection of voluntary human sacrifices, bound hand and foot, and delivered over to Mr. Eustace and his attendants to have the entrails of their intellects arranged according to the taste of that sacred priesthood. Through the rugged remains of temples and tombs and palaces and senate halls and theatres and amphitheatres of ancient days, hosts of tongue-tied and blindfolded moderns were carefully feeling their way, incessantly repeating prunes and prism, in the endeavour to set their lips according to the received form. Mrs. General was in her pure element. Nobody had an opinion. There was a formation of surface going on around her on an amazing scale, and it had not a flaw of courage or honest free expression in it. Another modification of prunes and prism insinuated itself on little Dorrit's notice very shortly after their arrival. They received an early visit from Mrs. Merdle, who led that extensive department of life in the Eternal City that winter, and the skilful manner in which she and Fanny fenced with one another on the occasion almost made her quiet sister wink, like the glittering of small swords. "So delighted," said Mrs. Merdle, "to resume an acquaintance so inauspiciously begun at Martigny." "At Martigny, of course," said Fanny. "Charmed, I am sure." "I understand," said Mrs. Merdle, "from my son Edmund Sparkler, that he has already improved that chance occasion. He has returned quite transported with Venice." "Indeed," returned the careless Fanny. "Was he there long?" "I might refer that question to Mr. Dorrit," said Mrs. Merdle, turning the bosom towards that gentleman, "Edmund having been so much indebted to him for rendering his stay agreeable." "Oh, pray don't speak of it," returned Fanny. "I believe Papa had the pleasure of inviting Mr. Sparkler twice or thrice, but it was nothing. We had so many people about us, and kept such open house, that if he had that pleasure, it was less than nothing." "Except, my dear," said Mr. Dorrit, "except as it afforded me unusual gratification to show by any means, however slight and worthless, the high estimation in which in common with the rest of the world I hold so distinguished and princely a character as Mr. Merdle's." The bosom received this tribute in its most engaging manner. "Mr. Merdle," observed Fanny, as a means of dismissing Mr. Sparkler into the background, "is quite a theme of Papa's. You must know, Mrs. Merdle." "I have been disappointed, madam," said Mr. Dorrit, "to understand from Mr. Sparkler that there is no great probability of Mr. Merdle coming abroad." "Why, indeed," said Mrs. Merdle, "he is so much engaged and in such request that I fear not. He has not been able to get abroad for years. You, Miss Dorrit, I believe, have been almost continually abroad for a long time." "Oh dear, yes," drawled Fanny, with the greatest hardihood, "an immense number of years." "So I should have inferred," said Mrs. Merdle. "Exactly," said Fanny. "I trust, however," resumed Mr. Dorrit, "that if I have not the great advantage of becoming known to Mr. Merdle on this side of the Alps or Mediterranean, I shall have that honour on returning to England. It is an honour I particularly desire and shall particularly esteem." "Mr. Merdle," said Mrs. Merdle, who had been looking admiringly at Fanny through her eyeglass, "will esteem it, I am sure, no less." Little Dorrit, still habitually thoughtful and solitary, though no longer alone, at first supposed this to be mere prunes and prism. But as her father, when they had been to a brilliant reception at Mrs. Merdle's, harped at their own family breakfast table on his wish to know Mr. Merdle, with the contingent view of benefiting by the advice of that wonderful man in the disposal of his fortune, she began to think it had a real meaning, and to entertain a curiosity on her own part to see the shining light of the time. Chapter 8. The Dowager Mrs. Gowan is reminded that it never does. While the waters of Venice and the ruins of Rome were sunning themselves for the pleasures of the Dorrit family, and were daily being sketched out of all earthly proportion, lineament, and likeness by travelling pencils innumerable, the firm of Doyce and Clenham hammered away in Bleeding Heart Yard, and the vigorous clink of iron upon iron was heard there through the working hours. The younger partner had, by this time, brought the business into sound trim, and the elder, left free to follow his own ingenious devices, had done much to enhance the character of the factory. As an ingenious man, he had necessarily to encounter every discouragement that the ruling powers for a length of time had been able by any means to put in the way of this class of culprits, but that was only reasonable self-defence in the powers, since how to do it must obviously be regarded as the natural and mortal enemy of how not to do it. In this was to be found the basis of the wise system, by tooth and nail upheld by the Circumlocution Office, of warning every ingenious British subject to be ingenious at his peril, of harassing him, obstructing him, inviting robbers by making his remedy uncertain and expensive, to plunder him, and, at the best, of confiscating his property after a short term of enjoyment, as though invention were on a par with felony. The system had uniformly found great favour with the Barnacles, and that was only reasonable too, for one who worthily invents must be in earnest, and the Barnacles abhorred and dreaded nothing half so much. That again was very reasonable, since in a country suffering under the affliction of a great amount of earnestness, there might, in an exceeding short space of time, be not a single barnacle left sticking to a post. Daniel Doyce faced his condition with its pains and penalties attached to it, and soberly worked on it for the work's sake. Clennam, cheering him with a hearty cooperation, was a moral support to him, besides doing good service in his business relation. The concern prospered, and the partners were fast friends. But Daniel could not forget the old design of so many years. It was not in reason to be expected that he should. If he could have lightly forgotten it, he could never have conceived it, or had the patience and perseverance to work it out. So Clennam thought, when he sometimes observed him of an evening looking over the models and drawings, and consoling himself by muttering with a sigh as he put them away again, that the thing was as true as it ever was. To show no sympathy with so much endeavour and so much disappointment would have been to fail in what Clennam regarded as among the implied obligations of his partnership. A revival of the passing interest in the subject, which had been by chance awakened at the door of the Circumlocution Office, originated in this feeling. He asked his partner to explain the invention to him, having a lenient consideration, he stipulated, for my being no workman, Doyce. No workman, said Doyce. You would have been a thorough workman if you had given yourself to it. You have as good a head for understanding such things as I have met with. A totally uneducated one, I'm sorry to add, said Clennam. I don't know that, returned Doyce, and I wouldn't have you say that. No man of sense who has been generally improved, and has improved himself, can be called quite uneducated as to anything. I don't particularly favour mysteries. I would as soon, on a fair and clear explanation, be judged by one class of man as another, provided he had the qualification I have named. At all events, said Clennam, this sounds as if we were exchanging compliments, but we know we are not. I shall have the advantage of as plain an explanation as can be given. Well, said Daniel, in his steady, even way, I'll try to make it so. He had the power, often to be found in union with such a character, of explaining what he himself perceived and meant, with the direct force and distinctness with which it struck his own mind. His manner of demonstration was so orderly and neat and simple that it was not easy to mistake him. There was something almost ludicrous in the complete irreconcilability of a vague conventional notion that he must be a visionary man, with the precise, sagacious travelling of his eye and thumb over the plans, their patient stoppages at particular points, their careful returns to other points whence little channels of explanation had to be traced up, and his steady manner of making everything good and everything sound at each important stage before taking his hearer on a line's breadth further. His dismissal of himself from his description was hardly less remarkable. He never said, I discovered this adaptation or invented that combination, but showed the whole thing as if the divine artificer had made it, and he had happened to find it. So modest was he about it, such a pleasant touch of respect was mingled with his quiet admiration of it, and so calmly convinced he was that it was established on irrefragable laws. Not only that evening, but for several succeeding evenings, Clennam was quite charmed by this investigation. The more he pursued it, and the oftener he glanced at the grey head bending over it, and the shrewd eye kindling with pleasure in it and love of it, instrument for probing his heart though it had been made for 12 long years, the less he could reconcile it to his younger energy to let it go without one effort more. At length he said, Doyce, it came to this at last, that the business was to be sunk with heaven knows how many more wrecks, or begun all over again. "Yes," returned Doyce, "that's what the noblemen and gentlemen made of it after a dozen years." "And pretty fellows, too," said Clennam bitterly. "The usual thing," observed Doyce. "I must not make a martyr of myself when I am one of so large a company." "Relinquish it or begin it all over again?" mused Clennam. "That was exactly the long and the short of it," said Doyce. "Then, my friend," cried Clennam, starting up and taking his work-roughened hand, "it shall be begun all over again." Doyce looked alarmed and replied in a hurry for him, "No, no, better put it by. Far better put it by. It will be heard of one day. I can put it by. You forget, my good Clennam. I have put it by. It's all at an end." "Yes, Doyce," returned Clennam, "at an end as far as your efforts and rebuffs are concerned, I admit, but not as far as mine are. I am younger than you. I have only once set foot in that precious office, and I am fresh game for them. Come, I'll try them. You shall do exactly as you have been doing since we have been together. I will add, as I easily can, to what I have been doing, the attempt to get public justice done to you, and, unless I have some success to report, you shall hear no more of it." Daniel Doyce was still reluctant to consent, and again urged that they had better put it by. But it was natural that he should gradually allow himself to be over-persuaded by Clennam, and should yield. Yield he did. So Arthur resumed the long and hopeless labour of striving to make way with the Circumlocution Office. The waiting rooms of that department soon began to be familiar with his presence, and he was generally ushered into them by its janitors, much as a pickpocket might be shown into a police office. The principal difference being that the object of the latter class of public business is to keep the pickpocket, while the Circumlocution object was to get rid of Clennam. However, he was resolved to stick to the great department, and so the work of form-filling, corresponding, minuting, memorandum-making, signing, countersigning, counter-countersigning, referring backwards and forwards and referring sideways, crosswise and zigzag, recommenced. Here arises a feature of the Circumlocution Office, not previously mentioned in the present record. When that admirable department got into trouble, and was, by some infuriated members of Parliament whom the smaller barnacles almost suspected of labouring under diabolic possession, attacked on the merits of no individual case, but as an institution wholly abominable and bedlamite, then the noble or right honourable barnacle, who represented it in the House, would smite that member and cleave him asunder with a statement of the quantity of business for the prevention of business done by the Circumlocution Office. Then would that noble or right honourable barnacle hold in his hand a paper containing a few figures to which, with the permission of the House, he would entreat its attention. Then would the inferior barnacles exclaim, obeying orders, "Hear, hear, hear," and "Read." Then would the noble or right honourable barnacle perceive, sir, from this little document, which he thought might carry conviction even to the perversest mind, derisive laughter and cheering from the barnacle fry, that within the short compass of the last financial half-year, this much-maligned department, cheers, had written and received 15,000 letters, loud cheers, had written 24,000 minutes, louder cheers, and 32,517 memoranda, vehement cheering. Nay, an ingenious gentleman connected with the department, and himself a valuable public servant, had done him the favour to make a curious calculation of the amount of stationery consumed in it during the same period. It formed a part of this same short document, and he derived from it the remarkable fact that the sheets of foolscap paper it had devoted to the public service would pave the footways on both sides of Oxford Street from end to end, and leave nearly a quarter of a mile to spare for the park, immense cheering and laughter, while of tape, red tape, it had used enough to stretch, in graceful festoons, from Hyde Park Corner to the General Post Office. Then, amidst a burst of official exultation, would the noble or right honourable barnacle sit down, leaving the mutilated fragments of the member on the field. No one, after that exemplary demolition of him, would have the hardihood to hint that the more the Circumlocution Office did, the less was done, and that the greatest blessing it could confer on an unhappy public would be to do nothing. With sufficient occupation on his hands, now that he had this additional task, such a task had many and many a serviceable man died of before his day, Arthur Clennam led a life of slight variety. Regular visits to his mother's dull sick room, and visits scarcely less regular to Mr. Meagles at Twickenham, were its only changes during many months. He sadly and sorely missed little Dorrit. He had been prepared to miss her very much, but not so much. He knew to the full extent, only through experience, what a large place in his life was left blank when her familiar little figure went out of it. He felt, too, that he must relinquish the hope of its return, understanding the family character sufficiently well to be assured that he and she were divided by a broad ground of separation. The old interest he had had in her, and her old trusting reliance on him, were tinged with melancholy in his mind. So soon had change stolen over them, and so soon had they glided into the past with other secret tendernesses. When he received her letter, he was greatly moved, but did not the less sensibly feel that she was far divided from him by more than distance. It helped him to a clearer and keener perception of the place assigned him by the family. He saw that he was cherished in her grateful remembrance secretly, and that they resented him with the jail and the rest of its belongings. Through all these meditations, which every day of his life crowded about her, he thought of her otherwise in the old way. She was his innocent friend, his delicate child, his dear little Dorrit. This very change of circumstances fitted curiously in with the habit, begun on the night when the roses floated away, of considering himself as a much older man than his years really made him. He regarded her from a point of view which, in its remoteness, tender as it was, he little thought would have been unspeakable agony to her. He speculated about her future destiny, and about the husband she might have, with an affection for her which would have drained her heart of its dearest drop of hope, and broken it. Everything about him tended to confirm him in the custom of looking on himself as an elderly man, from whom such aspirations as he had combated in the case of Minnie Gowan, though that was not so long ago either, reckoning by months and seasons, were finally departed. His relations with her father and mother were like those on which a widower son-in-law might have stood. If the twin sister who was dead had lived to pass away in the bloom of womanhood, and he had been her husband, the nature of his intercourse with Mr. and Mrs. Meagles would probably have been just what it was. This imperceptibly helped to render habitual the impression within him that he had done with and dismissed that part of life. He invariably heard of Minnie from them, as telling them in her letters how happy she was, and how she loved her husband, but inseparable from that subject, he invariably saw the old cloud on Mr. Meagles' face. Mr. Meagles had never been quite so radiant since the marriage as before. He had never quite recovered the separation from Pet. He was the same good-humoured, open creature, but as if his face, from being much turned towards the pictures of his two children, which could show him only one look, unconsciously adopted a characteristic from them, it always had now, through all its changes of expression, a look of loss in it. One wintry Saturday, when Clennam was at the cottage, the Dowager Mrs. Gowan drove up, in the Hampton Court equipage which pretended to be the exclusive equipage of so many individual proprietors. She descended in her shady ambuscade of green fan to favour Mr. and Mrs. Meagles with a call. "And how do you both do, Papa and Mamma Meagles?" said she, encouraging her humble connections. "And when did you last hear from or about my poor fellow?" My poor fellow was her son, and this mode of speaking of him politely kept alive, without any offence in the world, the pretence that he had fallen a victim to the Meagles' wiles. "And the dear pretty one?" asked Mrs. Gowan. "Have you later news of her than I have?" which also delicately implied that her son had been captured by mere beauty and under its fascination had foregone all sorts of worldly advantages. "I am sure," said Mrs. Gowan, without straining her attention on the answers she received, "it's an unspeakable comfort to know they continue to be happy. My poor fellow is of such a restless disposition, and has been so used to roving about, and to being inconstant and popular among all manner of people, that it's the greatest comfort in life. I suppose they're as poor as mice, Papa Meagles?" Mr. Meagles, fidgety under the question, replied, "I hope not, ma'am. I hope they will manage their little income." "Oh, my dearest Meagles," returned the lady, tapping him on the arm with the green fan, and then adroitly interposing it between a yawn and the company, "how can you, as a man of the world and one of the most business-like of human beings, for you know you are business-like, and a great deal too much for us who are not," which went to the former purpose, by making Mr. Meagles out to be an artful schemer. "How can you talk about their managing their little means? My poor dear fellow, the idea of his managing hundreds, and the sweet pretty creature too, the notion of her managing, Papa Meagles, don't." "Well, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles gravely, "I am sorry to admit, then, that Henry certainly does anticipate his means." "My dear good man, I use no ceremony with you, because we are a kind of relations. Positively, Mamma Meagles," exclaimed Mrs. Gowan cheerfully, as if the absurd coincidence then flashed upon her face for the first time, "a kind of relations. My dear good man, in this world none of us can have everything our own way." This again went to the former point, and showed Mr. Meagles with all good breeding that, so far, he had been brilliantly successful in his deep designs. Mrs. Gowan thought the hit so good a one that she dwelt upon it, repeating, "Not everything. No, no, in this world we must not expect everything, Papa Meagles." "And may I ask you, ma'am," retorted Mr. Meagles, a little heightened in colour, "who does expect everything?" "Oh, nobody, nobody," said Mrs. Gowan. "I was going to say, but you put me out. You interrupting, Papa. What was I going to say?" Drooping her large green fan, she looked musingly at Mr. Meagles while she thought about it, a performance not tending to the cooling of that gentleman's rather heated spirits. "Ah, yes, to be sure," said Mrs. Gowan. "You must remember that my poor fellow has always been accustomed to expectations. They may have been realized, or they may not have been realized." "Let us say, then, may not have been realized," observed Mr. Meagles. The dowager for a moment gave him an angry look, but tossed it off with her head in her fan, and pursued the tenor of her way in her former manner. "It makes no difference. My poor fellow has been accustomed to that sort of thing, and of course you knew it, and were prepared for the consequences. I myself always clearly foresaw the consequences, and am not surprised. And you must not be surprised. In fact, can't be surprised. Must have been prepared for it." Mr. Meagles looked at his wife and at Clennam, bit his lip, and coughed. "And now here's my poor fellow," Mrs. Gowan pursued, "receiving notice that he is to hold himself in expectation of a baby, and all the expenses attendant on such a addition to his family. Poor Henry! But it can't be helped now. It's too late to help it now. Only don't talk of anticipating means, Papa Meagles, as a discovery, because that would be too much." "Too much, ma'am?" said Mr. Meagles, as seeking an explanation. "There, there," said Mrs. Gowan, putting him in his inferior place with an expressive action of her head. "Too much for my poor fellow's mother to bear at this time of day. They are fast married and can't be unmarried. There, there, I know that. You needn't tell me that, Papa Meagles, I know it very well. What was it I said just now? That it was a great comfort they continued happy. It is to be hoped that they will still continue happy. It is to be hoped pretty one will do everything she can to make my poor fellow happy and keep him contented. Papa and Mamma Meagles, we had better say no more about it. We never did look at this subject from the same side, and we never shall. There, there. Now I am good." Truly, having by this time said everything she could say in maintenance of her wonderfully mythical position, and in admonition to Mr. Meagles that he must not expect to bear his honours of alliance too cheaply, Mrs. Gowan was disposed to forego the rest. If Mr. Meagles had submitted to a glance of entreaty from Mrs. Meagles and an expressive gesture from Clennam, he would have left her in the undisturbed enjoyment of this state of mind. But Pet was the darling and pride of his heart, and if he could ever have championed her more devotedly or loved her better than in the days when she was the sunlight of his house, it would have been now when, as its daily grace and delight, she was lost to it. "Mrs. Gowan, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "I have been a plain man all my life. If I was to try, no matter whether on myself, on somebody else, or both, any genteel mystifications, I should probably not succeed in them." "Papa Meagles," returned the dowager, with an affable smile, but with the bloom on her cheeks standing out a little more vividly than usual as the neighbouring surface became paler, "probably not. Therefore, my good madam," said Mr. Meagles, at great pains to restrain himself, "I hope I may, without offence, ask to have no such mystification played off upon me." "Mamma Meagles," observed Mrs. Gowan, "your good man is incomprehensible." Her turning to that worthy lady was an artifice to bring her into the discussion, quarrel with her, and vanquish her. Mr. Meagles interposed to prevent that consummation. "Mother," said he, "you are inexpert, my dear, and it is not a fair match. Let me beg of you to remain quiet. Come, Mrs. Gowan, come. Let us try to be sensible. Let us try to be good-natured. Let us try to be fair. Don't you pity Henry, and I won't pity Pet. And don't be one-sided, my dear madam. It's not considerate. It's not kind. Don't let us say that we hope Pet will make Henry happy, or even that we hope Henry will make Pet happy." Mr. Meagles himself did not look happy as he spoke the words, "but let us hope they will make each other happy." "Yes, sure, there leave it, father," said Mrs. Meagle, the kind-hearted and comfortable. "Why, mother, no," returned Mr. Meagles, "not exactly there. I can't quite leave it there. I must say just half a dozen words more. Mrs. Gowan, I hope I am not over-sensitive. I believe I don't look it." "Indeed you do not," said Mrs. Gowan, shaking her head and the great fan together for emphasis. "Thank you, ma'am, that's well. Notwithstanding which I feel a little, I don't want to use a strong word now, shall I say hurt?" asked Mr. Meagles at once with frankness and moderation, and with a conciliatory appeal in his tone. "Say what you like," answered Mrs. Gowan. "It is perfectly indifferent to me." "No, no, don't say that," urged Mr. Meagles, "because that's not responding amiably. I feel a little hurt when I hear references made to consequences having been foreseen, and to its being too late now, and so forth." "Do you, Papa Meagles?" said Mrs. Gowan. "I am not surprised." "Well, ma'am," reasoned Mr. Meagles, "I was in hopes you would have been at least surprised, because to hurt me wilfully on so tender a subject is surely not generous." "I am not responsible," said Mrs. Gowan, "for your conscience, you know." Poor Mr. Meagles looked aghast with astonishment. "If I am unluckily obliged to carry a cap about with me, which is yours and fits you," pursued Mrs. Gowan, "don't blame me for its pattern, Papa Meagles, I beg." "Why, good Lord, ma'am," Mr. Meagles broke out, "that's as much to state—" "Now, Papa Meagles," said Mrs. Gowan, who became extremely deliberate and prepossessing in manner whenever that gentleman because at all warm, "perhaps to prevent confusion, I had better speak for myself than trouble your kindness to speak for me. It's as much as to state, you begin, if you please, I will finish the sentence. It is as much as to state, not that I wish to press it or even recall it, for it is of no use now, and my only wish is to make the best of existing circumstances, that from the first to the last I always objected to this match of yours, and at a very late period yielded a most unwilling consent to it." "Mother," cried Mr. Meagles, "do you hear this? Arthur, do you hear this?" The room being of a convenient size, said Mrs. Gowan, looking about as she fanned herself, and quite charmingly adapted in all respects to conversation, I should imagine I am audible in any part of it. Some moments passed in silence before Mr. Meagles could hold himself in his chair with sufficient security to prevent his breaking out of it at the next word he spoke. At last he said, "Ma'am, I'm very willing to revive them, but I must remind you what my opinions and my course were all along on that unfortunate subject." "Oh, my dear sir," said Mrs. Gowan, smiling and shaking her head with accusatory intelligence, "they were well understood by me, I assure you." "I never, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "knew unhappiness before that time. I never knew anxiety before that time. It was a time of such distress to me that Mr. Meagles could really say no more about it, in short, but passed his handkerchief before his face. "I understood the whole affair," said Mrs. Gowan, composedly looking over her fan. "As you have appealed to Mr. Clennam, I may appeal to Mr. Clennam too. He knows whether I did or not." "I am very unwilling," said Clennam,